Welcome to Unscripted Journeys, the career journey series where we sit down with the leaders behind our organization's success to explore the journeys that shape their careers. I'm your host, Chelsea. In each episode, we speak with leaders across the business to uncover their experiences, decisions, and lessons that have defined their leadership paths, as well as the advice they have for the next generation. Each conversation is packed with honest reflections and key takeaways you can bring into your own career. Let's get started.
So my name is Thomas. I'm French from Brittany. I'm 44 years old, married with 2 children. I've been in Asia for about 20 years, in Malaysia about 5. And I've joined Mega Fortris, I believe, on the 1st of December last year. So it's been basically 5.5 months.
Still relatively new with us.
Yeah.
So what fields were you in before you joined in Mega Fortris?
Yeah. So my background is not, obviously, it's not related. And I think most of the colleagues know that I'm not from the industry. So I'm not associated with the security industry and certainly not the security sales industry. By education, I'm an engineer. I've gone through technical school since the age of basically 16, all the way to a master's degree in engineering, and which I complemented with a master's degree in international trade. So I'm coming from a different industry to respond to the question. The industry that I've served the most is basically the sort of projects and construction industry. I've worked basically 10 years prior to joining Mega Fortris. I've worked 10 years for engineering services company. So conducting projects, doing engineering, so producing a service to a client, which had to do with foreign direct investments in Asia. So we were doing factories for the likes of Heineken, Coca-Cola, and many others. In the last 5 years, just prior to joining Mega Fortris, I was with an equipment manufacturer from France, for which I worked 5 years. So about 15 years of project experience. However, all along in the sort of sales and project development and market development and distributors management. So really on the business side rather than the technical side, which I left basically after completing my master's degree. I didn't want to become an engineer per se, and develop the sort of technical commercial side of what my career would become.
Interesting. So you mentioned that you left the technical side and ventured into more of a project based in the business side of things. Why did you leave behind the technical side of the industry since you began in engineering, right? But you
Yes.
slowly progressed towards project based career. So why the change?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not very sure if I have a certain answer to that question, but I could say that I think having a more business-oriented type of a role, of a job, let's say, I think introduced the fact I was meeting way more people. That was a more sort of an external, outgoing type of a role. So meeting customers, engaging on projects that were always different, one from the other. And later on, basically also traveling to new cities, again, new project sites or new countries. So in fact, in 2010, I was in Malaysia. That was basically for the first time in Malaysia after 7 years in China. And so that was an opportunity I could not have had as an engineer working on the project. That would have been very, very local type of a job. Whereas as a business developer, to open market, to open new territories, new branches, I was tasked to open the Kuala Lumpur branch for my company at that time. That was the occasion to start venturing outside of new territories, new areas. Later on, that became even greater, whereby in Singapore, I was relocated in 2012. I was tasked to look after about 20 branches all over Asia. So looking after the entire region. I think I would not necessarily have had the same opportunities as a strictly speaking engineer, working behind a desk and behind the screen, producing drawings, specification sheets, calculations, schedule, etc. A business type of a job, I think, has that to propose. So it's, of course, it's very demanding because you spend a lot of time on the road, engaging with customers and sometime in the evening dinners, etc. So I spent a lot of time away from my family. But again, this is something that I think is interesting. You see different people, different cultures, different languages. And I think this is what I feel at the personal level, very, very interesting, very enriching. I come from, again, a small place in France. I started learning English at the age of, I don't know, maybe 14, which was a norm in France at that time. Now I speak 3 languages. In fact, I don't speak French and I don't speak English at home. I speak Chinese at home. So this is something I would never had the opportunity, I believe, as a strictly speaking, purely engineer to obtain. So yeah, I think the business side, complementary to the sort of engineering background, is very interesting. And I think this is what I could propose to certain younger auditors to sort of diversify their education and certainly learn new language, being afraid of traveling, going outside of their sort of comfort
zone?
zones. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it is certainly very enriching. You got to learn a lot of things and experience so many different cultures as well.
Yes.
For that whole journey, which would be the biggest career turning point?
I think this is certainly what I mentioned earlier. I mentioned 2010, but it was 2012. I think I was offered a position in Kuala Lumpur, which I took. That was in itself, that was basically obviously a career decisive moment, because I was again venturing into a completely new job, tasked to open the market from zero. I came to Malaysia in 2012, basically just with a suitcase. And I left 2 years after for Singapore, where I was promoted to. I left with behind me 100 engineers in the office, starting from zero. So that was very, very interesting from a career standpoint, because not only that was very intense in terms of what had to be done, but also offered me as a springboard, something else that was going to be a regional role in 2014, I believe, or 14. And not only at that time, if I can have a bit of a silly comment on the side, it offered me the opportunity to getting married and for us to have our first child, because I think we got married in 2012, around the same year basically that we moved to Malaysia from Guangzhou. And then we had our first child in 2014. So yes, it was these 2 years were very intense from all angles, so to speak.
So, could that have been a reason you could stay motivated during the tough or uncertain times? Because everything was new. You left behind your 100 engineers. You literally dived into a new environment with nothing. How did you stay motivated?
No, I had no lack of motivation. In fact, at that time in 2010, 12, the world, I think, if I say so, or times were very different to what they are today. On the economy, Malaysia at that time was still very, very attractive for certainly oil and gas players. And we were not doing oil and gas projects, but Malaysia was very attractive. I think all over Asia, in fact, we were seeing a lot of projects happening. It was very, very different to what it is today. Today, it's more complex and complicated. So I had no dip of stamina. But what I want to say is that, okay, I was, of course, going into a big adventure with no certainty. But what I knew within myself is that I was quite sure of my plan. You have to be humble in the fact that you're going into something that is going to be new. There's all sorts of uncertainty. You can't predict the market. You can't predict the reaction of the customers to a new player in this industry. You start from zero. So, of course, the learning curve is very steep. However, if you have a level of self-assurance without being too overbearing and losing humility, you have the ability to avoid having frustration or a motivation dip, as you asked.
That's interesting. That's a very interesting point of view. So, from there, did you learn any skills along the way that you didn't think you would need?
I think that has to go back to what I said earlier. I think the greatest learning points of my 20 years in Asia, because in fact, this is my 20 years career. I've never worked in France. I've always worked either in China, Malaysia, or Singapore, and of course in Asian countries. I think for me, the biggest learning point is really humility. It comes back to what I was trying to explain. We have, as salesperson, as business people, we have to be assertive. I think we have to be, however, treading carefully, not to appear overbearing, appearing that we want to twist the customer's arm or take advantage. I think, again, humility, the ability to sort of self-reflect and listen is extremely important. We have to be, again, self-assured, but the humility in that and the ability to be mindful with the cultures. And in fact, in Asia, the cultures are very, very important. The environment here is different to the environment I grew up in. So coming from Europe or France, I had a lot of self-assurance when I was young. And I think coming to Asia, of course, the language was the first issue. I could not necessarily communicate. 20 years ago, I could not communicate in China, whereas I can today. And so at the very first years, That humility really, that was, I think, a very, very big learning point. I could not sort of impose my way. And in fact, this is certainly not the way in Asia. So listening, humility, I think this is what I view as very important things that I was able to acquire, or I'm still acquiring, along the journey of my career.
Yeah, certainly. It's quite admirable that you learned a couple new languages. Learning languages is not easy in general. Even now, I'm learning Japanese in addition to what I've learned in Malaysia. It can be quite tough. So being able to speak Chinese now, Mandarin, is pretty amazing in my opinion.
No, 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 I don't think it is. I'm not amazed by my level. I can speak all day long, but I'm not amazed by my level. I know people that speak way better Chinese than I do. But I don't really know what I can say about language. This is just the way they are. In fact, when I was young, I studied Spanish. I was fairly okay in Spanish. And in 2005, I believe, I had my first experience in Asia as part of a school internship. And this is where I had the opportunity to pick up Chinese. With my friends, we were looking at Asia and saying, look, this is an opportunity. We can try. If we don't like it, then we go back to what we feel comfortable with in France. And if we like it, then this is an open door to entirely different things in Asia or Southeast Asia. And I started to work with the sort of Chinese world. So I was working in Singapore with a Taiwanese person in Singapore. That person was a fairly old gentleman. He could not speak English, or very basic English. And therefore, we had to find some level of Chinese to communicate. And eventually, when I was in China, there was absolutely no other way than speaking Chinese in the factories. I was going daily to different factories to do prototyping, QC, delivery, shipments, and so on. And the only way to speak to a foreman or a person on the factory floor in China is in Chinese. I don't see this as a miracle. Again, it took me a number of years to master. I'm still in fact learning. But I see, and this is what I see for my children and for young generation, I think speaking multiple languages. In fact, if I would have to do things again, I would pick up more exotic languages, maybe Arabic, I don't know, Indonesian or Malay, Russians, Turkish. These could be languages that are in certain region of, let's say, Central Asia. If you speak Turkish, you can speak to everyone. You can speak Turkish, in fact, in the west of China. You can speak Russian in a lot of countries around the CIS region. If you speak Indonesian, you have access to 2 countries in Southeast Asia, Chinese, of course. This is something that I see really as a value, but it doesn't come. These languages take a year to master. You know better than I do. Learning Japanese, I'm sure, is extremely difficult, but you have the luxury of being on this, let's say, within the country, so you speak all day long. So that, of course, helps.
Yeah, definitely. I think the attitude of not giving up and being confident in chasing what you think is important is very vital in this kind of journey. Because without it, you could easily give up, then you wouldn't want to do it anymore. But having the attitude to keep pursuing what you think is right, what you think is important, I think that's very, very good.
There is no fatality. So everything, at the end of the day, everything is sort of feasible. Of course, there are limits always, but let's say in general terms, I think there is no fatality. And this is what I say also to most of the sales team that I had to manage, now or in the past. There is no fatality. The market is different. Languages are difficult. The environment we work with, especially at Mega Fortris, it's a very commoditized industry we're in. It's extremely difficult. However, let not that be a fatality. There are ways of doing things differently. And of course, we have to have a degree of self-assurance that we have to be confident with our plan, confident with what we're thinking, the ideas we're thinking about. And we have to be humble along the way that there's going to be competitions here. There's going to be people that are going to try to dislodge us left, right, and center. But again, there is no fatality. And if we have a degree of self-assurance and if we are committed to a plan, there should be promising outlook. And without trying, in fact, you're also not giving yourself a chance to succeed. That can be applicable to languages, to education, to business. Yeah.
What's one mistake you made early on that you wish you could have avoided? If there were any mistakes that you think you made.
There are probably a lot of mistakes, honestly speaking. Let's be clear and transparent. I think every people makes mistake. What I keep on telling my children is that experience is avoid repeating twice the same mistake. So you're allowed to do mistakes. The idea is, however, to avoid, twice or multiple times the same mistake. That basically you're not acquiring skills or experience, but experience is, in my opinion, what I heard from my father in this case. Doing twice the same mistake is really silly. That should be counting as experience, and experience, again, building up on mistakes, but also successes. So I think if I can speak in general terms, I think what I would have to mention or what I would like to mention is avoid being very, self-assured, too self-assured. Of course, you have to have a degree of self-assurance, but what I was saying earlier, coming from Europe at a silly age, I was in my 20s, early 20s, out of university basically, or in university, a lot of self-assurance, we knew better. And this is a mistake, honestly speaking, because it's not because people do things differently here than they are necessarily inferior or worse or bad. This is what is very often reproached by the Western world of certain Asian cultures, is that the way things are done here is sloppier, faster, and therefore of lesser quality. I don't think this is correct to say that, but this is very fair to say that, for instance, things happen much faster in Asia. They happen faster, but they're not necessarily inferior in quality. So I think this sort of self-assurance can be a very sort of easy trap to fall into. And this is, I think, what I don't want to say this is one specific mistake that I made, but this is what I think I learned a lot to sort of avoid that self-assurance and bringing that humility and being able to be coherent with the local culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes a bit too self-assured can create misconceptions. There are prejudice and misconceptions that certain cultures will have of another culture. So it is good to be more open and understanding of the culture that you're going to head into. All right. So would you have one piece of advice that you would like to give your younger self?
And advice to my younger self, again, what I said earlier, get out of the comfort zone that you are growing into. I was born in a very small place, actually, by the seaside in France. I could have stayed there, could have been nice and simple and easy, totally different life. But no one should be scared to sort of explore, being humble and so on. And that can open people to new things, different ways of communicating, different ways of seeing themselves in the world, or different business possibilities. So this is what I would say. Just go out of the comfort zone, pick up languages, travel the world, expose yourself to different environments that are not going to be nice and easy. Some may be very challenging. It might be practicality of living. It might be difficulty of language. It might be difficulty of access. But all of this, I think, is very enriching, and not exposing yourself to this. Of course, some people are unable because it takes a bit of time and effort. But this is what I could give to younger generation. Don't be afraid of taking an internship outside of your country. Try to mobilize on skills that you have not developed too much within your comfort zone. And I think that's, at least for my children, this is the advice I'd like to give them. And they're already taking multiple languages, so at least the language is already there. Then we'll see where they get higher education and internships and their first jobs and so on. But speaking those languages, I think, and having the ability to maneuver in different cultures is something that is in their back pocket now and that they can capitalize on. Of course, you have to have skills on top of that. You have to have an academic background, and this is for them to build. But if we speak about the exposure to new cultures, new environments, obviously languages, I think is what I see extremely important in this world.
Yeah, I think that's a very solid advice to give. What is the best piece of career advice you have received?
I'm not sure if there is one in particular, but I remember a couple of my former managers or colleagues. And I think what I will always remember is that I remember specifically one manager that I had in China as well as a colleague and an indirect manager. Really, the fact that actions speak louder than words. What I'm trying to say is that you can, and certainly as a salesperson, you can have all sorts of projections on market and so on, but what counts at the end of the day is really getting customer through the door, getting the business, getting the projects and so on. And again, there can be all sorts of difficulty on your market. It can be a red ocean flooded by undercutting types of competitors. It can be anything, in fact. But really, there is no excuse to be found there. So, and certainly as a salesperson, there's really, again, no fatality, no excuse to be found. And the only thing that counts is really actions and obviously success beyond the actions, but at least the very thing that is going to be perceivable to people is concrete actions. And leading by example as well, the same thing. You can manage a team in a very, very micro way, really doing things for people and so on. But that doesn't really, you're not really mentoring people. So what I've seen from former managers is that they were having the ability to lead in a way that was not overbearing. And this is what I'm trying to do today. lead in a way that is, showing an example, but don't go in the micromanagement or become an absolute, overbearing force on the team. So that's what I have seen from former managers, which I'm trying to replicate and use today. But I see myself as still a student of very senior members that we have. We have in Mega Fortris, we have a very strong team of entrepreneurial people. And of course, this is fairly new to me. My previous job was in a company that was founded by an entrepreneur, but different style, obviously French person. This is now different, and I'm still trying to inspire myself from their sort of management style and the way things are done.
I believe there is always something new to learn every day. So being able to absorb any knowledge that you can get from the people around you is quite a positive influence.
Yeah, that goes, I think, with listening and having the ability to gain self-reflect. Yeah, the self-assurance, you have to keep this to a minimum. So listening, having the humility, self-reflection ability, this is what I think is extremely important, especially now that at the beginning of my career, I was accountable for things that I was doing myself. I was an executive, like every graduate from university. So I was doing a lot of things myself. And the more I grew into different roles, of course, I was tasked to have a team operate on behalf of a company. So really more of a managerial role, having the ability to self-reflect, lead by example, listen to the team, but yet mobilize action and not vociferate, loud words and so on. I think this is extremely important. This is the life of a manager. This is what you have to have in terms of abilities as a manager.
I agree. With all the changes and growth in your leadership style and your management style, how do you define success now versus when you started? Was there any difference?
I think this is what I just said, actually. I think, again, when you start and when I started, I was evaluated on my personal ability, my individual performance, which is not the case anymore, and certainly was not the case in my previous jobs. I was looked through the angle of a team's performance or a region's performance, and I have behind me or next to me a network of distributors, for instance, or a team or subsidiaries that work not necessarily for my team, but work towards the same goal since they are in the same area. So this is, I think, the biggest difference, but this is a difference, I think, is in the life of many managers. You start as an individual and you grow into a leader.
So from individual, it becomes team focused, I would say. With that, how do you maintain a work-life balance?
That's a very interesting question because obviously we're in Asia. I don't need to tell you that in Asia, this balance between work and private life is very subtle, especially since we also work across time zones. So there can be very late phone calls, very early discussions. It's difficult. It's a challenge. My wife is also at a more humble level. She's an entrepreneur in her own way. She has a small business. So she's herself also very busy. Not so much for Mega Fortris. I'm not traveling so much, but in my previous job, I was working overseas probably 50-60% of my time. So I really didn't spend too much time during the week, at least in Malaysia with the kids or in Singapore when I was there. So it's extremely difficult. And I don't think I'm the best to advise on this. What I find for me here really personal, what I see as something that I use is basically sports. So I do my fair share of running. In my case, I can do that in other sports. So I try to go certainly in the weekends, but during the day, during the day or work week in the morning or late in the evening, I try to go for a run. In fact, this weekend I have a 50-kilometer trail race in Genting. So this is going to be a long day out in the jungle. But these are things that I try to do because I need to find a way to sort of escape, let go whatever thoughts are in my head. What we do as a family is we do very often picnics, a day out at the waterfall, at the river, in the forest, at the beach. And in Malaysia, there's a lot on offer. So within a day, we just go out, hop on the car, go out, an hour and a half drive, and then we are at the waterfall jungle. Very quiet environment, very pleasing environment, green. And we have a good time with the family. Kids playing in the river, waterfall, etc. We do a bit of a barbecue. So that's very fun, doesn't take a lot of time, and it's very easy to do. So we do quite a number of that.
It's pretty nice though. You said that you are not very good at it, but from what I hear, I think you are still pretty good at being able to carve out a moment of your time in your life to spend with family and your own personal hobbies since you run, right?
Yeah, I
So,
try.
yeah, let's move along to looking ahead. Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, and I don't know if I can really respond directly to this. I don't think I really know myself. But what I can say is that if I take a bit of a tangent and if I respond indirectly to your question is what is interesting in Mega Fortris is I think, and it's obvious to everyone, I'm not going to, come up with things that are entirely new, but the company is, I think, at a bit of a turning moment. The company is this year celebrating its 30th anniversary. The company has listed on the 11th of November of 2024. But I think there is a turning point in the company. There are now big investments happening in the UK, in Malaysia. There is a lot of ambition in developing new lines of businesses and products to tap on the less commoditized types of goods or services. I think this is what, for me, at the personal level, very interesting because this post-IPO, if I can call it that way, is for the next 30 years and the years thereafter. I think it's going to be very interesting. And I think this is what I would like to see myself playing a role in having an equally successful coming 30 years, equally successful to the past 30 years. Of course, times are very different. Competition is more aggressive, all sorts of circumstances, but I say there's no fatalism to be had. It's just hard work, it's just commitment, certain degree of self-assurance, but also looking at ourselves in the mirror and having the ability to self-reflect on what we're doing. And I think I can see, I'd like to see myself for more than 10 years, in fact, in Mega Fortress, trying to help the senior management, the board of directors, the company as a whole, really in developing a successful story for the coming 30 years and beyond. I won't be there in 30 years, probably. I'm already too old for that, but there is certainly for the 15 years to come, there's probably a lot to be made, sorry. And this is where I think there is a strong personal interest for me and certainly a lot to be done within the company.
Yeah, I like the way you worded it, that there is a story to be written. So there are a lot more chapters to write, a lot more projects to work towards. Yeah, I like the way that was worded. Yeah. What's something about your career that most people wouldn't expect?
I'm not sure if I have something to say specifically on the career, but if I would have just one thing to say, this interview I could have done in Chinese, for instance.
Wow.
It's a very light-hearted comment. I'm not trying to brag, but this is something that not necessarily a lot of people know. That I speak Chinese. I speak Chinese at home, in fact, and I could have done this interview entirely in Chinese without being too much in difficulty.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I don't think I would be able to do this fully in Chinese. I
No,
don't think I can.
I'm sure you would be able to. But so now, if we go a bit more serious, what people don't know about my career, I've never worked in France, as I said before. I'm French. I'm 44 years old, and I've worked in Asia nearly half of my life. This is most likely where I will also finish my career, I would believe. So I see myself, in fact, of course, I'm European. I look French. I have a French accent, I'm sure. But yeah, I see myself, as a little bit of a blend. My children certainly look Eurasian, if I can use that word. I don't. But I see myself a little bit more than Asian than the average expats that you see here in Asia. And I think that the language, the understanding of the culture helps.
Yeah, I agree. There is a different vibe I can feel, even though I've never met you personally, but the vibes I get is definitely different from other Europeans that I've met
All right. Well, we'll see each other in Penang.
in November. Yeah. All right. The last one. What's your go-to mantra or quote when you need a boost?
I don't think I have a quote or, something very intellectual coming from, Churchill or big names, big figures. But what I keep on not saying myself every day, but, every now and again, it's certainly what I say to my children, but also to myself, that again, there's no excuses to be found. There are difficulties everywhere on all levels, but nothing is for free. There is no free meal. There's no free ride in this world, unfortunately. So everything deserves a little bit of, or in some cases, a lot of effort. And it's not because it's difficult that it's immediately impossible or immediately overwhelmingly hard. And I see this as a sales person. I'm not speaking here about today. I'm speaking here about the past. I've seen often instances of certain salespeople being very frustrated about their markets for X, Y, Z reason, all valid. But as salesperson, this is not what we should come up to when management asks for results and an action plan. The market is what it is. There are difficulties, but we should really try to avoid come up with excuses for not performing. So really what I'm trying to say to myself is try to overcome those difficulties. In fact, use those difficulties to your advantage. It's not always possible, but there are instances where actually that could be a possibility. So yeah, I'm trying to avoid things too negatively. Difficulty as they're not necessarily to move away, but then as a person, fronting those difficulties, what is your plan? You have to be humble. You have to be having the ability to self-reflect. Are you doing the right things? Are you hitting the right strings? Is the tune you're playing achieving the end goal you're trying to go for? That's what I'm trying to reflect upon when difficulties, especially in the commoditized world we are playing with at Mega Fortris. So this is what we have to rack our brains on. What can we do different? What can be impactful enough to bring significant contribution to the business and keep the competition away?
Thomas joined Mega Fortris just 5.5 months ago, but his story spans 2 decades across Asia, from China to Singapore to Malaysia. And it's an interesting example of what happens when you're willing to leave your comfort zone. Here's what struck me most about our conversation. Thomas learned early on that being smart and self-assured isn't enough. Coming from Europe, he had to unlearn the assumption that different ways of doing things meant inferior ways. And that lesson became the foundation of everything that followed, a deep humility paired with real conviction. He talks about leading by example, not by micromanagement. He talks about actions speaking louder than words. But the thing that really resonated is his refusal to accept excuses, even in difficult markets. He says there's no fatality, no reason to give up, only problems waiting to be solved. That mindset, combined with his ability to truly integrate into the cultures he works in, that's what makes him stand out. And as he looks ahead, Thomas sees Mega Fortris at a turning point. Post-IPO, the company is expanding, innovating, moving beyond commoditized products, and he wants to be part of writing the next chapter of our story. So whether you're early in your career or leading a region, Thomas's message is simple. Get out of your comfort zone, stay humble, listen more than you talk, and remember, there's no excuse not to find a way forward. That brings us to the end of today's episode. We hope you found valuable insights and key takeaways from this conversation. If you have any thoughts, reflections, or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of Unscripted Journeys.